Recently, we bought our first smart TV, and as I've been playing around with it, trying to figure out how it works, I've come across a couple of 9/11 documentaries that I never saw before, including one that's an interview with a fire captain from New York. He's been on the job as a New York City firefighter for nearly 40 years. And even though he wasn't working on 9/11, he's the commander of a ladder company in Harlem, he talks about how his company was one of the few companies in the city that actually lost a member but had the rest of the crew survive. When they responded to the towers, the officer who was working that day left his crew in a staging area and then went into the first tower to collapse, to go to the command post. And while he was at the command post, that's when the tower collapsed, trapping and killing him. This fire captain goes on to talk about how he knew nearly half of the 343 firefighters who died that day personally, and that he worked with over 100 of them at one point or another in his career. It's gut-wrenching stuff. But then this fire captain goes on to talk about something else. He talks about the weather that day, how gorgeous it was. He goes out of his way to make the point that the previous week or so was miserably hot and muggy, and that 9/11, the weather broke, and it was just a picture-perfect kind of a day. That seems to be a common theme in all these documentaries. When people are remembering 9/11, talking about it then or now, they seem to work in at some point the fact that it was a beautiful day, a picture-perfect day. I remember that day. It was gorgeous. Not a cloud in the sky, low humidity, the temperature just right. But the weather that day is just an incidental detail. It's not essential to the story, to the history of 9/11. It's kind of a throwaway remark, like, oh, by the way, the weather that day was gorgeous. If it had been a hot, miserable, muggy day, it wouldn't have made any difference to the meaning and importance and impact of that tragedy. In John's gospel, when he talks about the discovery of the empty tomb, he says that the women who went there go and tell immediately the male disciples, which causes Peter and the beloved disciple to then immediately run to the tomb to check it out for themselves. When the beloved disciple looks in, he sees the burial clothes of Jesus lying there on the ground. And according to John, seeing them, he believes. However, in Luke's gospel, it's only Peter who goes to the tomb. And when he looks in, inspecting the tomb to try to see that Jesus' body, make sure it's not there somewhere, he notices the burial clothes on the ground, but doesn't make anything of it. In fact, Luke says that he turns around and walks away from the tomb completely perplexed. In other words, the burial clothes in Luke's account are just an incidental detail. They aren't essential to the story. They have no meaning or import. They don't create any kind of belief or faith or anything else. They're a throwaway remark. Peter went in, inspected the tomb, and he happened to see that Jesus' burial clothes were on the ground. It's the virtually unanimous consensus of scholars that John's gospel was written last. That means that here in this account of finding the burial clothes of Jesus, that Luke is certainly easily the earlier and more accurate story historically. And historical scholars, historical critics will say that incidental details in these kinds of stories are usually accurate, usually authentic, because no writer would insert something, invent something that happened to have no meaning or import or symbolic value to their story. That means that those first disciples who discovered the empty tomb probably did go in, inspect the tomb, see that the body wasn't there, and just happened to notice that Jesus' burial clothes were there, not knowing what to make of that, not finding that in any way meaningful, not having that do anything in terms of interpreting what had happened there. Why does all this matter? Well, outside of a miracle, the way most people try to explain the reality of the empty tomb is that either somebody stole the body, or for innocent reasons, somebody moved it. Grave robbers in those days would never take the time to remove clothing from a body that they were going to steal. But much more importantly, the only thing of value in the tomb was the grave clothes or articles kept with it, not the body. The body was worthless. So if anything, grave robbers would have taken the clothes and left the body. And if somebody wanted to move the body for innocent reasons, they wouldn't dare risk defilement. The Jewish purity codes forbid coming in contact with a dead corpse, a decaying decomposing body, decomposing flesh. So if somebody were to move the body for innocent reasons that we don't know, they would have certainly wanted to keep the clothing intact around the body to prevent coming in direct contact with the flesh. That means that the best explanation for why the body wasn't there but the grave clothes were is the one that the disciples would eventually give, the resurrection. Now, while the grave clothes, and I want to emphasize this, are not part of the major evidence for the resurrection, they're not one of the big pieces of evidence for the resurrection. There's so much more of that. This lesser evidence, this lesser detail, this intriguing detail is something that corroborates that larger body of evidence in an amazing way. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this blog or any other. Please go to the Contact EJ page of this website or the Raising Jesus Facebook page. You can leave your comments or questions there. I'd love to hear from you.